Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome again. Welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Moshe. This is Moshe Norman out of Lakewood, New Jersey. It is February 10th, 2025. Started announcing the dates so that we can, you know, keep oriented. And tonight we have with us the expert of the Unified Protocol, which we're going to talk a little bit about, Dr. Todd Farchione from Boston, Massachusetts. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's pretty good.
I'm trying to get the Boston right. We in New Jersey, it's like Boston, and
Boston.
it's spelled Bawston, right? So, thank you, Dr. Farchione, for joining us tonight and giving us of your time.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited to have this discussion because e- everybody who's a regular here knows that, my passion and my baby in the world of psychotherapy is about the therapeutic process and talking about the process and how to enhance the process and how to, I guess, transcend uh, difficult circumstances that inhibit the process or get in the way of the process and how we do all that. And every once in a while, when we hear something that's a little bit more manualized, my eyebrows are raised and I get kind of interested and say, okay, can this be? Can we have a manualized protocol that actually helps people? I mean, don't people need to feel held and be safe and redo some of the early traumas and what do they call it? Child of origin stuff, family of origin stuff. And how's it going to help to have a protocol that sounds so cognitive, so behavioral, so dry, and so manualized? And so tonight, Todd is going to tell us a little bit about how this is actually possible and what actually goes on in the unified protocol. So, Todd, do us a favor, just tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, what's your relationship or connection to the unified protocol, and just your general history in the field. And
Yeah,
thanks
sure.
again.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show here. So I'm a research professor over at Boston University. I've been there for a little over 20 years. I did my graduate work out at UCLA, and I worked primarily in fear processes and anxiety disorders at UCLA, and then I came to the East Coast to work with a psychologist named David Barlow. And David Barlow was he was an expert in anxiety disorders, and that was his primary area of work. And so I started working in his lab actually as a postdoctoral fellow, and this was in the early 2000s. And at that time, we started discussing this unified protocol. And a lot of it really came from the convergence. There was a lot of research at that time really looking at different disorders. And I think the question that started to come up, despite the splitting sort of approach that we see with the DSM, was we recognized, that there were a lot of similarities across these disorders. And this is, at the neurobiologic level, but also we see it clinically in the form of comorbidity, right? So usually individuals, if they have one anxiety problem, they often have other anxiety difficulties as well. But if you look at the DSM, each of those disorders is sort of categorized as a separate disorder, which
Mhm.
I think actually can be problematic in terms of diagnosing individuals. And a lot of the symptoms, when you look at the different disorders, a lot of the symptoms, there's quite a bit of overlap, right? I mean, some of the same symptoms will come up in different disorders. So we started thinking about, could there be this single protocol? And a lot of this really was generated from Dave and his work as well. In the late 80s, he sort of raised it. It was in his Anxiety and Its Disorders book in the late 1980s. I think it was 1988. And he sort of raised this idea. And this was in line with his triple vulnerability model. And so in the early 2000s, he sort of brought it back to the front and said, well, maybe we can develop this. And so started out actually as a group treatment, because you could see some potential advantages of the unified protocol in that way, because it could treat a number of different problems at the same time. But then it ultimately went towards an individual format because of the grants and this type of thing, and conducting research. And that's where it's been. And then we published the first edition in 2011.
So
And
just to be clear, you and David co-developed
so
this
we
unified
co-developed.
protocol.
Yeah, so I've been there right from the beginning, and I was on sort of an initial version. Yeah, initial right from the beginning. I think I wasn't there in the first couple of groups. I wasn't a therapist on the first couple of groups,
Hmm.
but then shortly thereafter, in terms of the development of the protocol, Dave and myself and a number of students and other postdoctoral fellows, we sort of developed it.
Hmm.
And uh, then we published it in 2011, and then we published the second edition, I think it was in 2017.
Hmm.
Uh, and we're working on a third edition right now. It's really taken off quite a bit, Moshe. It's now been translated, I think, into 12 different languages, and it's used really worldwide, which is nice.
Todd, you call this the unified protocol for transdiagnostic treatment of emotional disorders.
Yeah,
That's a
it's a
that's
great
a
name.
packed statement. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean when you talk about transdiagnostic treatment of emotional disorders? I
Yeah,
think you kind of sort of explained it, but
yeah, well, there's some key terms there, right? And the term transdiagnostic really wasn't that prevalent in the early 2000s, and so it's now you can find it quite a bit. And the interesting thing about this idea of transdiagnostic, I think it can be confusing for people. So um, transdiagnostic to a lot of people means, simply applying it across different diagnoses. And the unified protocol can be used for a range of internalizing disorders. It's also been used in the context of medical conditions. We're doing a study on it right now in type 1 diabetes to help individuals in sort of managing their anxiety around diabetes and diabetes care. It's been
mhm.
used in the context of Parkinson's disease.
Hmm.
So, really to address the affective components of these different problems. But transdiagnostic for us means more than just simply applying it across different disorders. For us, it's really in thinking about what are the shared, you can call them psychopathologic mechanisms that become important across the different disorders. And for us, it's really, the unified protocol is really focused on addressing these high levels of negative affect. Um, uh, what in the personality literature and sort of has been described as neuroticism,
Hmm.
in combination with the related sort of emotion dysregulation that you see. That seems to be important to all the different disorders, and that's really what the UP is addressing. It manifests as these processes like things such as anxiety sensitivity, experiential avoidance, perfectionism. So these different sort of processes, psychological processes that are more transdiagnostic in nature.
Hmm.
So when we think of transdiagnostic, it's really the idea that we're trying to get these shared mechanisms that are an essential component of the development and maintenance of those disorders. And that's different than simply just saying, well, I have a treatment that works for everything.
Hmm.
We've actually written a paper on this and described it as those are more like universally applied principles. We see that with, say, cognitive therapy is a more universally applied sort of principle. ACT has a lot of these universally applied principles. And it's a distinction that we've sort of talked about. But but yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to get at the sort of the core of these disorders, and that's what we think of when we think of transdiagnostic. And then the other piece of the title, the idea of emotional disorders. So people say, well, what are emotional disorders? And emotional disorders are those disorders that are characterized by high levels of negative affect, and then in addition to that, another essential sort of aspect of neuroticism is that tendency to see those emotions as being uncontrollable and unpredictable. So people will have an aversive reaction to their own emotional experiences, which then results in avoidant coping. So those aspects, right, the high levels of negative affect, the aversive reaction to those emotions, and then the avoidant coping, those are the characteristics of emotional disorders for us.
Hmm.
So that captures all of the anxiety disorders, captures obsessive compulsive disorders, traumatic, the traumatic disorders. It captures unipolar sort of depression. There's been some work even in bipolar depression, so in borderline personality disorder. So these are where emotion dysregulation becomes sort of a core component of those disorders.
Hmm.
Um, that's that's sort of what we consider as sort of a hallmark
So,
aspect of
so let me just ask you, I'm trying to follow this and I want to make sure I understand the idea. I think I'm hearing you say that if DSM has broken uh, um, or boxed in, right,
yeah,
clusters of symptoms into different diagnostic names, let's call them, right? But nevertheless, there's still many features or symptoms that span across these different diagnoses.
yeah,
So, for instance, perfectionism may be a symptom of obsessive compulsive disorder, maybe a symptom of generalized anxiety, right? And et cetera, with so many other phobias,
right.
maybe also symptoms of different diagnostics. Is that about right?
That's right. That's
Okay.
exactly.
And so when we talk about transdiagnostic, we're saying there may still be underlying similarities or um, connections between the symptoms of various disorders.
Yes.
And so the treatments can overlap. And that's what makes it transdiagnostic?
Yeah, well, it's not just the overlap in the symptoms. It's really for us, this core sort of temperament of neuroticism, and that's going to manifest at different in different ways depending on certain experiences that somebody may have had
Hmm.
in their life. So it's sort of you can think of it as almost like neuroticism is this sort of predisposition. It's this tendency for people to experience these strong sort of negative emotions and to respond in sort of an aversive way to those emotions. And so in individuals that may be more vulnerable if they have certain experiences. So for example, somebody uh, has a family member that is struggling with sickness, and so maybe they go on to develop concerns about physical health and illness. And so then they could go on to develop like an illness anxiety disorder or panic disorder or something like that because of the heightened anxiety sensitivity. So the disorders are essentially just these phenotypic sort of symptom minor variations in symptom presentation at the surface level, but it represents this neurotic temperament. It represents sort of that underlying high negative affectivity, aversive reactions, and avoidant coping. Those are sort of the key aspects of any of these disorders.
Okay. I mean, the little detective in me is sensing some some dynamic stuff going on here, some psychodynamic stuff, with all this
Yeah,
different experiences that people have in their life is going to cause certain symptoms to manifest. Okay. Okay.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
like I said, we may be more similar than different.
Yeah, well,
Like
unfortunately, yeah, no, I think you're right, and
yeah.
it's funny because I've had so many individuals who are more psychodynamically oriented in terms of their approach, and they come up and they say, the focus on emotion, this is very consistent with what we do. The focus on early, these experiences that somebody had and how that led to sort of the symptom expression. That's very consistent with some of the ways that we think about it, and I do think there's probably some overlap there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's encouraging. Okay. So Todd, let's hear. By the way, I just want to remind everybody, for those of you who might be new here, um, and for those of you who haven't yet, I'm encouraging you to please use the React tab on the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, ask questions, or comment. We're happy to take the questions. We're happy to hear comments. And please don't be shy. If you, for whatever reason, need me to pause the uh, recording, if that will be a deal breaker for you, I'll even do that. Special free coupon tonight. Okay, so please, just we want to hear questions, we want comments, and we want input and feedback. Okay, Todd. So tell us a little bit about what is this unified protocol? What did you discover? Create? What are we talking about here? Tell us a little bit about
Right,
it.
so the unified protocol consists of 8 different modules, but there's 5 core modules. And those modules, I mean, when we really think about it, the way that I describe it to my clients is that it's really to help them to experience their emotions differently and respond to them. So experience their emotions and respond to them differently. And so each of those modules is really trying to target those components I was mentioning to you, right? Especially that aversive, that tendency to sort of see those emotions as being unwanted or as being uncontrollable or
Mhm.
unpredictable, and then trying to help people with that avoidant coping. So the primary modules, we have like an initial module that really focuses on motivation, so it gets people ready for treatment, setting goals, this type of thing. The second module is talks about the importance of emotions, why we have them, how they serve us, and starts to get into some means of tracking, which is essentially moves into the third module, which is being sort of mindfully present with one's emotional experiences. So one of the first things that we want our clients to do with this treatment is to really be able to connect with their emotional experiences in a particular way. Okay, we want them to connect in the present moment, so as it's happening, to see it as it unfolds, and secondly, without judgment. And the reason that we work on that judgment piece is because of what I was mentioning to you. If they see it as uncontrollable, if they see it as being problematic, it's going to lead to those avoidant behaviors, right? If somebody is frightened by their own experience, frightened by their own emotions, they're going to
Mhm.
do something to shut it down, okay?
Or I can imagine, the other side of the spectrum would be, or it leads to neurotic behavior, such as trying to fight the experience. I can't have this. I'm right.
Exactly.
I can't be nervous. I can't be anxious. So then I go and I fight it, and I go back into that loop and that cycle.
That's right. And when
Okay.
you talk to clients about their emotions, I don't know about you, but I've heard those things a lot. People will say, there's something wrong with me for feeling this way, or I shouldn't feel upset.
Hmm.
I shouldn't feel sad. They'll try to change the emotional experience very quickly and not really process it. And for us, that's sort of the root of the problem is that
Hmm. Hmm.
they're engaging in that.
But I'm curious about that. How do this is a question that comes up for me a lot in therapy. And the more cognitive you are, the more logical and simple the answer is. But the more dynamic you are, the less reverence you have for logical answers because we don't necessarily believe that they do much for the client. So let's take that as an example where a client, because this comes up, like you said, all the time in the therapy room. I shouldn't be so nervous about this. Nobody else is nervous about it. Or I shouldn't be so nervous about it. My parents told me that it's nothing to worry about, right?
Right.
So how in fact, so we want to always have people become mindful, which means to be able to experience it without the judgment.
That's
But
it.
how do we actually create that experience for them that it is okay if experientially they know on a deeper level, they know that it's not okay?
Yeah. Um, well, the idea of knowing, they know that's what they've been told, right? So that's kind of how they are viewing it in that situation. Um, well, I think there's a couple of things. One is if somebody makes those types of statements, I will try to understand it, right? I'm going to ask them why they shouldn't feel the way they're feeling to help me to understand why they shouldn't feel that. And I guess that gets at that sort of cognitive piece to some extent
Hmm. Hmm.
and gets down to this idea of what are your specific judgments about your own emotions, right?
But Todd, I know that I shouldn't be feeling this. I know that it makes sense that I'm feeling this, but I feel. whenever this happens to me, I have this reaction that in my feeling in my gut that knows that I should not be feeling it. So I may
Yeah,
know, but
yeah.
I know differently.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it depends on the model that you're coming from, right? But I will talk to people about some of these experiences that they have, and they say, well, I'm scared about this situation, and everybody else is not scared of this, so I shouldn't be scared of this
Yes.
situation. But when you really look at why they're scared of that situation, particularly in terms of the cognitions that they're having, it makes sense that they would be experiencing fear in that situation.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
see a lawfulness there, right? So if I think about the situation as threatening to me or
Hmm.
damaging, right? Maybe it's a
Hmm.
social situation and I think people are going to think negatively of me or
Hmm.
something like this, right? That's going to create an emotional reaction in the
Hmm.
same way as if there really was a threat. And so experiencing that emotional reaction, that situation, like it is actually unfolding the way that that emotion unfolds.
Yes.
Well, the difficulty for people is that they recognize that given the circumstances, right, the logical brain is looking at that situation and going like, there's actually not a threat, and yet I'm
Hmm.
having a reaction to it as though there is.
Right.
But that emotional part of their brain doesn't know that yet, right? You have to sort of, and that's the basis of like what we do with exposure
Hmm.
work
So
is trying to
the answer, I mean, that's precisely my question. My question is, if I know experientially and somatically that this is dangerous, and I know logically that it's not dangerous. Obviously, my somatic experience is going to take over because I'm going to fight, flight, or freeze.
right,
Doesn't matter what my logic says. And so,
right,
how do we create that shift in
yeah,
such a cognitive model, or is it
yeah.
not?
Yeah, so you can do that in a couple of ways. I mean, one, you can address it more directly, but as we know, for things particularly like fear and anger,
Anxiety. Hmm.
emotions that emerge very quickly, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Cognition tends to go out the window in those situations. You can somewhat use it probably prior to going into a situation. For us, a lot of it comes from the act of being willing to experience the emotion, because the idea is that the emotion happens, and then essentially it gives us an opportunity to respond to that emotional experience differently. So in a situation, as an example, like when we're afraid, there's going to be what we call emotional behaviors or emotion driven behaviors tied to that. So my fear is going to cause me to respond to that situation in certain ways. It's going to manifest in my physical appearance, my face. It's going to
Hmm.
manifest in how I hold my body. Perhaps I even leave the situation, right? But what happens if I produce that emotional reaction, say through exposure or something like that? I elicit an emotional reaction of fear and I stay put. Or I respond to that situation in a way that's not afraid. After a period of time, that emotional part of the brain, that emotional system that what you're describing as the somatic system,
Hmm.
starts to learn that that situation is not dangerous.
So there needs to be. I think you're saying there needs to be a cognitive piece in addition to the exposure. There needs to be some logical, rational work that this is okay and it's not scary, and then we go to the exposure. Is that
Yes,
right?
well, I think that's a good way to approach it. Like in the way that we do exposure, we will go through that cognitive process prior to entering the situation.
So how is this different than, let's say, classical ERP, what you're describing?
So ERP, right? I mean, ERP could follow sort of along the same lines of what we're doing, right? With ERP, it's basically exposure, and then you prevent the behavior. We've extended that sort of model. I mean, ERP is a good example of exposure therapy. I mean, that's what
Hmm.
it is.
Hmm.
We've extended that model to other disorders outside of obsessive compulsive disorder, which is where ERP really was primarily sort of used. I mean, that's where it originated, was around obsessive compulsive disorder. But we're applying it to other things like addictions and um, you know a range of anxiety disorders. It's no surprise actually. Most of the exposure-based treatments align very well with what we're trying to do with the
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So you got us through the first four modules.
4 modules. Okay, so let me
Let's
go
go.
on.
I'm sorry, you got us through the first three. We're up to number four.
Yeah, we're up to number 4. So number 4 is cognition. And for us, it's, we moved a little bit away from that traditional sort of cognitive, Beckian cognitive approach, which takes more of, they really sort of emphasize this rational brain, where they take the cognitions, they identify errors in thinking. For us, we sort of describe it a little bit differently. We want to improve sort of what we describe as cognitive flexibility. So it's
Mhm.
that ability to sort of see things from different angles and to consider alternative outcomes. And a lot of that came out of the work in generalized anxiety disorder, where, I don't know if you remember, they'd have sort of these pie charts that you would sort of go through these pie charts that would say, like, this is one possible outcome, but what are some other outcomes? What are some other things that might happen here? And the act of considering alternatives tends to then diminish the likelihood in one's mind of, the negative one being the only way that this is going to play out. So we sort of built off of that in many respects. And I think we really focus on, a couple of different sort of ways of thinking that people kind of get locked into. But generally speaking, I think the idea is to try to look at those situations differently, to generate alternatives. And that the act of generating the alternatives is therapeutic, that's helpful to the individual. And the other piece that we really emphasize is the focus on emotion. So those judgments that we were talking about, we treat those as cognitions that need to be addressed within the context of the treatment itself. And a lot of cognitive behavioral treatments don't really do that. They don't really focus on the cognitions that people have about their emotions and them being unwanted. What does it mean that I have certain emotions? I've had I had one client tell me he's going on a first date, and he said to me, he didn't want to go on this first date. I was sort of asking him, what's going on there, and he said, well, I'm going to be anxious on this first date, because I haven't done a lot of first dates. And first off, I'm thinking to myself, like, pretty much everybody's anxious on a first date, like that's kind of the nature of the beast. And I said, well, how does it make you feel, when you get anxious in these situations? He said, well, it makes me feel like a wimp, like I'm less than a man, to be anxious. And she's going to see that I'm anxious in that situation and think that I'm not really a man, right? Which, again, you see so much wrapped up in that. The idea of, like, only, men are not supposed to have emotions, or not supposed to be afraid, or not have anxiety, and this type of thing. So he's creating this performance-based situation that limits his ability to just experience what he experiences in that situation, you know, which that pressure that he's putting on himself simply was, intensifying any
Yes,
anxiety that he was going to experience going into
adding
that.
anxiety upon anxiety.
Yeah, so he's adding fuel to the fire, and so for us in the cognitive, flexibility, we try to work on that. We try to work on, how do you see your emotions? What does it mean about you that you
Mhm.
have certain emotions, right?
Mhm.
So that's module 4. Module 5 is focused on behaviors. And we talk about emotional behaviors, and that's things that occur in relation to strong emotions. And so primarily that's going to capture avoidant behaviors, and that can take on many forms. That can take on forms of a cognitive avoidance, like distraction. We see worry as a cognitive avoidance. We see rumination as an avoidance strategy. Um, we see then there's also, subtle behavioral avoidance, which, that could take on many forms in terms of, it might be like giving a speech but standing right behind the podium and not leaving the podium, or reading one's speech, from notes or something like that. Um, Little subtle things that people will do to sort of avoid their emotions in these situations. And then there's also more obvious avoidance and things like that. And then in addition to that, we talk about what we call emotion-driven behaviors, and those again are behaviors that are driven by the emotional experience itself, and they're based in the emotions. So, like, anxiety makes me more hypervigilant, so I'm sort of looking for danger, or I'm sort of threat focused. Fear makes me sort of either fight or run away, and that's going to have a whole cascade of behaviors tied to it as a function of the emotion. So we try to help people to really notice what the behaviors are and then to start thinking about what could I do differently. When
Mhm.
my emotion tells me to act this way, can I act that way?
Mhm.
Right. So it's sort of that idea. I like to say, my emotions are not the boss of me. I'm the boss of me. So making that decision of how I'm going to respond to those emotional experiences in certain situations. That's module 5. 6 and 7 are really about exposures. 6 is focused on the somatic component to become more comfortable with the somatic component, tolerant of those sort of physical feelings. And then module 7 is really about what we call emotion exposures. So getting into situations to elicit an emotion with the sole purpose of responding differently to that emotional experience. With the idea being that over time you'll get a process of extinction in addition to inhibitory learning. So the person is sort of learning something new about that situation, particularly about their emotions and how they respond to their emotions, but about the situation overall by not engaging in the behaviors that they typically engage in.
Mhm.
Those behaviors in the short term may reduce their emotional experience, but long term it's causing some problems for
Okay. I want to ask you, this is maybe a little bit more on a personal level, but I myself struggled with a number of anxieties when I was younger
them.
that I don't struggle with anymore. And I'm going to mention two of them, and I want to share my challenge with what you're describing.
Yeah,
One of them was a fear of dogs. I was absolutely terrified of dogs until I was in my 30s. And at that point in my 30s, I decided to work on it, and I transcended the fear of dogs, which I can tell you about. And the other one was the fear of public speaking, which also lasted, well into my 30s, notwithstanding Mondays with Moshe, which somehow seems different because it just was a conversation and everybody else can listen. So I guess I sort of characterized it differently in my mind, and I wasn't afraid
yeah,
to be public. But both of those phobias, if we can call them that,
yeah,
were debilitating and terrifying.
yeah,
Okay, so if we talk about either, let's talk about the public speaking because that was much more problematic, right? There were
yeah,
many times where I was asked, either to say something publicly or even just to announce my name and say something about myself. As in as a social work intern, when we'd have group meetings or whatever, go around the table, and
yeah,
I'd wait for it to be my turn, with dry throat, um, paralysis, really paralysis. Can't think of what I was going to say, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly to get up and actually speak publicly or perform publicly. Now I can have 100 people in the room and talk, but if as soon as it's like a formal speech, suddenly, that's what happened. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because when the anxiety hits, it is so debilitating, it is so paralyzing that any cognitive spiel or uh, conversation, dialogue
yeah,
that I might have with myself or with anyone, trying to convince myself or reconcile, that this is something that's going to have a different outcome, et cetera, et cetera, was completely derailed
yeah,
because the somatic experience, the emotional experience was so intense. So
yeah.
talk to me, help me with that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think your no, I mean your description of it is very good and very accurate, sort of in terms of what happens with a fear reaction, panic
Hmm.
sort of reaction
Hmm.
in the situation. By the way, I felt the same thing. I feel the same way about those round table types of things. It used to be terrifying for me, and I would prepare the speech in my head, right? Because I would
Hmm.
almost always be the last person, and I'd sit there for 5 or 6 people, and every person would come along and I go, "Wow, that's such a better story. They're such a better speaker than me."
Hold on, Todd. I'm wondering, maybe it's not just us. Of the 25, 26 people who are right now in the group, how many others? Maybe all of us are scared. Wouldn't that be cool? And we should start off in meetings that way, right?
Yeah, we should. We
My
should
name is
work on
Moshe. My name is Moshe. I have terrible social anxiety, especially when it comes to saying my name. And I can
that. Even talking about myself, I'm still like that. I don't like telling stories, telling people about myself. Um, but you're asking about the somatic piece. I agree with you, and I think certain emotions, that's much more the case. Fear and anger, I've noticed where the cognitive piece, I'm not sure it applies. Like that idea of like in the moment trying to sort of access a different way of thinking about a situation
Mhm.
when you're somatically your body's just like, this is a bad situation. This is a dangerous situation, right? So, one of the things that I do with those emotions, and I'll tell my clients, look, going into a meeting, get your head straight around how you see yourself, the importance of the meeting, try to reduce the pressure that you put on yourself
Mhm.
regarding your performance, right? Cognitively, I think people can do that prior to going into a situation.
But I would literally be up the whole night before. Well, I mean, not if I had to say my name at a meeting, but if I had to give a little speech or a little something, I would literally not sleep the entire night, twist and turn in bed, cold fingers, gripping anxiety,
Yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. I'll spare you the details, but
yeah,
really gripping, and um, and then it actually many of the cognitions, that you want to replace it with, such as what's the likelihood that it's going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. Many of those become irrelevant because if you're so anxious, it is going to happen. You are going to fail.
right,
You
right.
aren't going to be able to perform. So seriously,
Yeah,
yes, right. So
yeah,
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So
yeah.
I mean, how does take me through the process of the unified protocol and how they would deal with something like that?
Well, I think, you depends on where you are in the process, right, of going through the treatment. But let's say that you have a number of skills, some of the skills on board in terms of things you're working with. To me, that's an anticipatory sort of distress that you're experiencing over, um, the public speaking situation.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because you can go different ways with it, right? I mean, you could go that route of like, what's going to happen with your anxiety, but often with performance-based situations, you're trying to sort of think about what are the implications of not being able to perform in that situation. So the questions might be, how you ask those questions can be really important. So like, if somebody else were to be in that situation and struggle with talking about their history and how would you view them, right? And trying to get down to this idea of, what are the implications? What's going to really happen here? But I think also it depends on the individual in terms of how I would confront it around the exposures. Like I wouldn't necessarily, even use that meeting. Let's say you had to be in this meeting where it's higher stakes or something like that. I don't think that's a great place to start,
Right.
right? And it takes
So if
something
you're doing
that's,
gradual, if you're doing more gradual
yeah,
exposure.
I would do it more gradual. I'd sort of say like, let's dial it back. If you're having such a strong reaction in that situation, we can either try to dial that back a little bit so that you can do what you need to do in that situation prior to going into the situation, or we need to start a little bit further down, on the list and say, okay, well, let's try to get some social situations that will feel a little bit more accessible for you at this particular point.
Okay, so that's to the exposure.
Yeah.
That's the exposure part of the treatment. What about the other modules? Where do they come in?
Yeah, so the first module, like the mindfulness module, right? I mean, trying to be connected with one's emotional experience, I would ask you to identify the different components that make up that emotional experience. So you're laying there at night. I mean, I try to understand, what is going on there, and there's usually a behavior tied to that, even, right? Maybe you're thinking about what you're going to say, or you're going over it in your head. Like even the
Yes,
idea of ruminating and worrying
yes.
about it, like becomes a behavior, and it's not helpful. That
Mhm.
behavior is not going to be helpful to you in that situation,
But
right?
if I don't ruminate and then I'm going to forget and I'm going to forget parts and I'm going to mess it up,
Will
I
you?
have
Will
to
you?
ruminate.
Will you? See,
Yeah.
that's the question. That's the question, right? And I would say that the exposure gives you the opportunity to go into that situation, ideally to not plan for it
Right.
and just let it rip, right? I mean, in terms of how I sort of addressed it, as I was telling you about, sort of going, and I never got to the place where you are in terms of the night before, but I certainly would experience panic symptoms around that table as it came around to me. And at some point, I just was like, I'm not going to pay attention to everybody else. I'm just going to wait for it to come to me. I'm not going to plan it in my head. And so behaviorally, I then just allowed myself to say what
Right.
it is I needed to
So
say.
that's interesting. It seems that we each have different ways of
Yeah.
figuring out how to cope with it. When,
Yes.
I think the main somebody asked me in the chat like how I got over it, what helped me, and again, like I think that as we spend enough time ruminating over how to help ourselves, over the course of time, we each come up with different kinds of strategies. Your strategy was shut down. You had enough cognitive belief or knowledge of yourself that when it comes time to saying your name, you'll be able to say it
Yeah.
and say something about yourself. Now it was a matter of, is it going to come out right? Am I going to forget something, et cetera, et cetera? And so you recognize that, well, I know I can do it. So now let me just shut everything off. And then when it comes, I'll just spontaneously let it happen. For
Yeah.
me, I think the coping strategy was more uh, a lot of exposure because whatever it was that I was afraid to, I had to do many, many times. But throughout that exposure, learning other experiences, which I don't know. I'm trying to think whether having learned that cognitively would have helped me, or having learned it experientially was
Yeah.
more helpful. But
Yeah.
learning that um, it's okay if I forget certain things during the speech. People forget; they don't necessarily pay attention. They don't remember. And then learning also like there's key parts to a speech that are actually really important and other parts that are less important. So if you
Right.
get in the more important things, those sometimes you can give a 10-minute speech, but only like 30 seconds of it may have really left its impression, right? So
Yeah. A
people
couple of
don't
sound.
remember all the words and all the extra narrative and all the junk that comes out,
Yeah.
and then um, doing also what I call a little bit of a screw you attitude, where you have to, you get what I'm saying, right? Where it's like, I don't care. This is my time. It's my party. I'm making the speech now. Either I was asked to speak or I'm the one making the party or whatever it is. It's my time to speak, and I'm gonna just do whatever I want. And it doesn't feel right to me, but I
Yeah.
had to sort of develop that thick skin and that
Yeah.
bastard mentality in order to be able to do that. And then once you're able to get there, then you can start toning down and becoming a little bit more reasonable.
Yeah. No, I think that's and that's not, I think that's, I hear a lot of things that you're saying that I think would align nicely with how I would sort of talk to you
But
about.
I had to learn the hard way. That's the thing. I would have preferred to meet you when I was 16
Yes.
instead of when I was 40,
Yeah.
45,
I would have liked to have met myself when I was
right? Right?
16.
We didn't get anything back then. We were just scared and nervous or whatever.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you on that.
Okay.
So, and yeah.
Any questions or comments from the group? Because I still feel like, Todd, I'd like to understand a little bit better how this, distinguishes itself from typical cognitive behavioral therapy. I would think that cognitive behavioral therapy in 2025 probably incorporates more emotion and things like that as the worlds merge, closer and closer, and everybody starts to recognize the value of each other's modalities. We always have to start a very dogmatic, and it's like this is the thing that works and the only thing, and then everybody kind of calms down and starts to appreciate what else. How would you distinguish yourself from cognitive behavioral models?
Yeah, it's a good question, Moshe. I'm not sure. It is a cognitive behavioral treatment. I mean, we use sort of cognitive behavioral treatment elements. I think what we tried to do is we tried to provide guidance, maybe in a more manualized form for people in utilizing, a total package to be able to sort of see people through all of the different steps. And there really weren't a lot of good manuals around that. There wasn't, most of the manuals really focused on specific disorders, which didn't work very well for clinicians because, you think of getting them out, disseminating those protocols because most people don't come in with just one problem. So it sort of immediately raised questions for people like, how do I utilize this protocol? I think that the UP is, it's helpful for young clinicians. Like we've seen it very helpful for young clinicians in practicing CBT because it provides enough guidance without, I think, really restricting them from being in therapy with the person, being there in terms of the experience. One of the things that you had asked me early on about emotion and sort of how do we help people to not respond negatively to their emotions? I think we model that to some extent, in
Mhm.
terms of being a therapist, being open to people experiencing emotion in the situation, validating that experience for people.
So you're talking about the classical therapeutic process,
Of course,
right?
yeah, yeah, of course.
That
Yeah, I
that
don't
that
think, yeah, no approach that we take, like any manualized treatment, it can't neglect that, in
Mhm.
my opinion.
Mhm.
That's just counseling. That's the basics of being able to be in a room with somebody, and it's hard to teach young clinicians that, they want to rely on the book, and but like what I do with my trainees, like I don't let them bring the book with them.
Mhm.
They can't sit there and like go through it with the person, like read it from the book. They need to just think of it as a framework.
So that's yeah, that's what I think I'm hearing. What I think I'm hearing you say is that it's a protocol. It's not that the
Yeah,
interventions per se are that much different or might not be different at all, but
right.
there's a sort of framework that a clinician is creating in their mind. And what is that? What are they looking for within that framework? Are they looking to see, have we passed module? Are we complete or past module one, two, three, four? Is that what they're looking to do? Have they perfected or mastered being mindful about their emotions and feelings?
Yeah,
And if that's really incorporated strongly and solidly in place, then
yeah,
that part of the sort of intervention,
yeah.
they're okay with. Is that what they're looking to do?
Yeah, I think there's different ways that people will do it. So some people will go sort of through the whole protocol, pick up the skills, go towards the exposures, and but other people, like, I think the way that I sometimes use it with people is I do take more time with specific skills or specific modules, to feel more comfortable with that. So for example, like mindfulness around, we start off by sort of helping people to practice more of a mindful. We think of it as like it's not mindfulness, and there's plenty of like
Meditation.
mindfulness
You
out
mean
there,
it's not
right?
meditation, right?
It's mindful awareness
Hmm.
of emotional experiences. So the idea is we want people to be more connected to those experiences, and we do exercises around that. So we'll ask people to look at emotionally provoking material. Like it could be songs, it could be written material, like poems, it could be movie clips, but things that evoke emotion. The idea being that we want them to sit with that emotion and look to see how they're judging that emotion. So for us, I think it's important to think of it as skill acquisition, but there is a lot in terms of the dynamic between the therapist and the client in talking about emotions and really processing those in the session. Sort of asking the person like, what is that experience? What are your reactions to that experience? And that becomes part of the process for us as well. I think it becomes part of the therapy.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Todd, I just wanted to ask you, do you offer any trainings or any resources? What can we if somebody wants to, pursue this model and learn more, where can they find out more about it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of places where that we do, and we have for some time now, and there's a couple of places. So one is the Unified Protocol Institute, which is a training institute that we established originally and sort of aligned with the research program, but then more recently it sort of became its own entity, and that offers workshops. I think 2 workshops a year, introductory workshops, and then it also has like more advanced training options, for supervision, consultation, that type of thing. And then the other thing, we developed a training course on the Unified Protocol. It's a video-based course that's offered through psychwire.com. And PsychWire actually has a number of different training courses on DBT. It has one on ACT. It has sort of fundamentals of CBT, and a whole range, compassion-based. I think they just developed a compassion-based therapy training, which was really interesting. emotion focused treatment with, so that one. So there's a number of different, Sue Johnson, Russ Harris for ACT, Marsha Linehan for DBT. So a number of different options there. So PsychWire now offers a course on unified protocol. And interestingly, like I'm actually on the forum answering questions and that type of thing. So it's like a little side thing that I help
How
out with.
fun.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty good.
Gotta diversify in this field.
Yeah,
You know, you gotta diversify.
yeah.
Okay, let's take a question. Shauna, I think you had a couple of questions, please. And if you have any anxiety asking your questions, well, maybe that can be the first one to Todd.
Yeah.
So Todd will fix that in a moment.
Okay, hi. This is actually my first time here. I'm a
Wow, good
PsyD
for you.
student. Um,
ID student. Good for you.
yeah, thank you everyone here for arranging. I don't even know much about it, but I saw it on chat and I'm glad I'm here. Um, yeah, so I I did put three questions in the chat. I guess in writing, it's not as anxiety inducing to ask a lot of questions.
That's all right.
Um,
What were your questions?
okay, so going back a bit, you had kind of mentioned in passing, and I was just curious to hear a little more. Um, you said that worry and rumination are kind of seen as avoidance,
Yeah.
which was pretty counterintuitive, at least um, initially. So,
Yeah, because most people when they talk about their worry will say, "I don't want to be worrying," right? And so it's in general, like one of the things that we see with the unified protocol, one of the things that we do with the unified protocol is we try to understand the function of different behaviors for people. So it's not that worry is automatically a avoidance strategy for somebody. It could be, it could be more of an emotional behavior, emotion driven behavior. But we certainly try to understand what function a particular behavior serves. And there's a couple of things that the research there's a couple of things that the research has found, right? So one, if you look at some of the work of Borkovec, um, they found that worry actually produced a decrease in physiological responding, which would suggest that it may serve more of an avoidant function, right? Because you would expect it if it's working the person up, the idea is like it should increase their physiological reaction, right? And what we believe worry, what are broadly worry and rumination are considered sort of repetitive negative thoughts. They fall under a category of repetitive negative thoughts. Obsessions sort of fall under that as well. But when you look at worry, the function of it sometimes for people is that the act of worrying makes them feel like they have some control. So it's like basically, it's almost like a superstitious thing where it's like if I worry about it, then it's not going to come true, right? It's not going to, the bad thing isn't going to happen because I'm going to be prepared for it. I'm going to have my finger on the pulse of this. I'm going to be able to sort of do something about it. The problem is that they're often worrying about things that were never going to happen in the first place, right? The other model that comes up is, I think it's called the contrast model or something to this effect. Evelyn Behar was one of the primary authors of this. And the basic idea is that worry may serve the function for some people of keeping them at a certain state so that they don't experience a sudden sort of change in that emotional state. So it's almost like when people think the worst because they don't want it's almost like they keep their expectations low because then if something doesn't go their way, like they worry about feeling good about it because then they're going to be, if it doesn't work out the way that they want, they're going to feel really bad. So it's a contrast between the emotional state and what they're afraid of feeling, right? So if I feel happy about something, eventually I'm going to feel bad because that happiness is going to fade. So I'm just not going to feel happy about it. And so the idea is that worry might keep it in a more sort of subdued state so that no contrast happens, okay? Again, serves an avoidant sort of function. Rumination could be a little different in that it's sort of this idea of replaying things. It's sort of chewing over my failures and ruminating on the things that I've done wrong in my life and stuff like this. We're not exactly sure, what that is. I think of it as more of like an emotion-driven behavior that often comes up with depression, where the person sort of feels depressed, and so they're focusing on sort of these depressive thoughts and memories and sort of playing it over and over again. But you see it in other problems as well, like social anxiety. The person like has a social interaction and for days they're thinking about how I made a fool of myself. And the thing I said, I'm sure everybody noticed when in fact nobody noticed. That I offended that person when in fact I didn't offend anybody, but I'm thinking about it. I'm playing it over in my head. Maybe so I don't make the mistake again or something like this. But either way, it sort of is not going to be helpful to me.
Okay. Did you had another question or two?
Yeah, it sounds like you had some other questions there.
Go ahead.
I do. I can steal the rest of the time on
Go
here.
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. You'll be a co-interviewer.
Okay. Um, yeah, thanks for that. I think I see more about the worry and less about the rumination.
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah. Well, rumination, yeah, it's a little tough in terms of nobody really is clear on what the function of it is, right? I mean, it's sort of just I. That's why I'm saying I think it may be a manifestation of the mood itself, like the low mood is sort of driving that particular behavior. But I see it as a behavior, even though it's a cognitive process. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can think of it as a behavior, and in that way, if you can identify it as behavior, same thing for worry. Like with some clients I've had, you know, we've actually we've actually just tried to. There's an old sort of approach. I think it was called worry time, and I'll tell people just like if you worry during the day, try to just drop it, kick it to the end of the day, and then you spend a good hour just worrying about whatever it is you worry about. And during the day, I need you to really focus on your work, and so it's a sort of an attentional control type of thing where you have to let it go. But it's hard because I think the function of it for some people, again, is because they think something bad is going to happen. So sometimes I'll incorporate more of the cognitive piece of like, what are you worried about? What is the thing that, and work with the cognitions a little bit so they can drop that tendency to be thinking about it because it becomes, it's the same as like an obsession in many ways for people. They just keep going over it and over it in their head. So the uncertainty is what you're essentially exposing them to. It's like, I'm going to allow this to unfold without worrying about it. I'm just going to see where this thing goes. And for people who tend to be anxious, that's like incredibly upsetting. They don't want to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to ask the last one or?
Yeah, okay. So my other two, I guess they could kind of be combined. I'm just curious a little more about the unified protocol. Um, so Moshe touched on it a bit, about like, mastery of specific sections versus um kind of integrating all parts of it in treatment. So I guess I was just curious about if there's a sequence um in administering it versus a more like integrated approach,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then more like on the side of uh I guess analyzing if it's a good approach. My question is how you assess if someone is a master of it and can administer it like in a
Yeah.
quality assured kind of way.
Okay. So two questions there. And I'm going to try to remember the first one. Okay. So yes. So we haven't had an opportunity to do much with looking at different sequences. There was some research that we did on maximizing strengths versus addressing weaknesses. So there are some skills assessments that you can do around the different primary skills. So to what extent can somebody restructure their thoughts, or to what extent, are people avoiding sort of their experiences, right? So there's measures that you can use to try to get at different components of the treatment. And so we did some work in trying to, see if we could stack the modules to either address the person's strengths, so sort of working with their strengths, or addressing their weaknesses. Both worked well, but the strengths actually produced a faster change. But most of the work that we've done with the protocol has really been sequential, all 8 modules. So I think that's our recommendation, is to do it in that way. Uh, we've toyed with the idea of trying to get to the exposure component a little faster. And that would align with some of the treatments like FOA's treatment for, I think, ERP, the idea of exposure and response prevention, some of the exposure-based treatments for OCD. But what I find with those treatments that go directly to exposure, they are often very difficult for clients because they just get overwhelmed by that sort of experience. And so I find that the early modules help to prepare the person to then be able to do the exposures in the most effective way. So I would recommend doing it sequentially, and I would recommend all 8 modules. The 8th module being just a wrap-up type of module, but certainly the first 7 modules. But some people
Yeah,
do.
it also,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess it also allows some time for a therapeutic alliance before.
Yeah. Yes. No, you can't, there's no substitute for therapeutic alliance. You have to have the therapeutic alliance. And a lot of that comes from one's ability to deliver this in a masterful way. And that kind of gets to that second question, right? I think there's a difference between adherence and competence. So you can adhere to a protocol and not administer it competently. And I think really what you want to shoot for is sort of competent delivery, and some of that is just a judgment, more broadly on the dynamic and the experience between the therapist and the client, and to what extent, does the client seem engaged? Are they getting the treatment? This type of thing, and going through the different skills and utilizing those skills. But I think a lot of it still is based in some of the basics of the therapeutic process around like validations and things like that. Which, by the way, I think one of the things that I like about the protocol, is the de-emphasizing the idea of symptoms, and really focusing on emotions, and trying to understand the process, how it unfolds. There's no judgment there, right? If somebody's talking about being anxious in public speaking or whatever, like, there's from the therapist, it's just trying to understand the relationship between those variables. And I think as people approach that in that way, it's very sort of, it can be validating of the emotional experience and takes away a lot of that judgment. And that's part of the problem that I have. I mentioned, like, I have problems with the sort of the DSM, is because, all those diagnoses, I mean, it just makes people feel so pathologized. You walk out of there with like 4 or 5 diagnoses, and you're getting recommendations for medication to control it, and all these different things. And I'm not saying people can't take medications. Trust me, like, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm just thinking that I find that it can be so stigmatizing for people, and I think part of why we wanted to go this direction is to be able to say, like, look, we all have emotions, and we have to try to understand, our emotions, and sort of work with them in a way to not have. It's not about not having them. It's about having them to the right extent, in the right situation, with the right person. Like, that's a difficult thing. That's emotion regulation, right? And that's a difficult thing to do. But we can all do that and get better at that. Like,
Yeah.
that's important in terms
Sometimes
of.
I think that we should add it to the social norm, like the questions of, hey, how you doing? And then one of the questions should be, and what's your diagnosis? It's like
Right,
we all have something, right? So,
right. Of
like,
course.
what is it? Let's just get cut to the chase, right?
Right. Let's cut to the chase. What are the
Are you the
problems?
more and you hear what's funny is you hear today's kids talking way differently than we did when we were kids, right? My kids are talking about the children in their class who are ADHD or OCD. They know these terms. Like, I
Yeah.
didn't hear these terms again until I was in my 30s, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. Uh, Somebody's asking a question, directly asked me a question, and I'm not sure, my understanding is that the unified protocol focuses primarily or predominantly on neuroses. But what happens if you have a person who feels inadequate, feels unwanted, unloved, unlovable? Is the protocol targeting something like that, or is it more for more sort of neurotic kind of experience?
Yeah, well, in terms of the research on it, I mean, there's been quite a bit. I mean, it's really mostly around, so it'll be the studies. If you look in the research literature, it's around these studies that focus primarily on the different disorders. So mostly what you're going to find are going to be the anxiety disorders. It's more moderate sort of effects, like we see very large effects for anxiety disorders. It's more moderate when you're talking about depression. And that's an area that we're trying to work more on and sort of building that into the protocol um, in a different way. And part of that, we're focusing more on positive emotional states. We're trying to incorporate, some things actually from more positive psychology to assist in that and helping people connect with their positive experiences and positive emotions more. Because it's not just about high negative affect. It's for many disorders, it's also about low positive affect, or an inability to sort of connect with those positive emotions. But in terms of like that sense of like being unlovable, being unwanted, or being sort of, yeah, I guess unlovable is sort of a core belief that some people carry with them. Often you see it in the context of, say, something like a depressed state. I do think the skills in the UP could be utilized, but you need a therapist who can do that, who can sort of work with it in that way. Like I mean, I've worked with people that struggle with that. And to me, there's a couple things that become important. It's going to manifest at the level of cognition. So the cognitive flexibility could be helpful in that way. And then, beyond the cognition, I think the emphasis on behaviors. People who believe that about themselves, who lack that confidence, who feel like they're not lovable, and sort of that will manifest in relationships, that will manifest in how they interact with people, it'll manifest behaviorally, it will manifest. And so the ability to identify what those behaviors are, to create scenarios that allow them to then change those behaviors, can then help them to gain that sense of being sort of I guess lovable. But you can challenge that directly, and sometimes I try to understand the origins of it. Like, where does that come from? A core belief about oneself. Like, what does that even mean? It's not like you're not deserving of love. Like, you're so like, what is it, rotten or terrible or just unwanted? Like, what does that really, mean about oneself? And so, I find the cognitive work and can be helpful in that way. And then ideally, we can identify for somebody, like, how can you present yourself in a way where you believe that you are lovable,
Hmm.
and adopting those behaviors.
Yes. Okay. Well, I want to thank Aaron Herzog for connecting us. That was a lovely and insightful conversation. Dr. Todd Farchione, I got that right,
You
right?
got it. You got
I got
it.
it. Yay. On Unified Protocol
Yeah.
of Transdiagnostic
It's
Treatments of
diagnostic.
Emotional Disorders. It's a mouthful, but it's a worthy mouthful.
Yeah, I
And
appreciate
I want to thank you for giving us of your time and this insightful discussion and conversation, for answering our questions. And for those of you who missed the beginning, you can see this hopefully tomorrow on YouTube or anywhere else. You'll get the email. If this is your first time here and you're not signed up to get the Mondays Motion Flyer and you missed the past 200 episodes or so, please reach out to me now. It's a lot of catching up to do. And, you can choose whichever ones you want to watch. Thank you, everybody, for joining and participating. Hope to see you next week. And I think this week I might send out an email of some of the next few weeks in advance, which is not my style. So thank you again, Todd, and have a good night.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and thanks for the questions as well.
Okay, and good luck to you.
Thanks.
And if anybody wants to stay on to say hello, you know how I love to meet everybody.
I'm gonna take off.
Okay, be well.